Hey guys, why does it feel like after we graduate, school gets worse?
Decline.
Millions of American students are falling behind in reading and mathematics.
Crazy to think in the big year 2025, American kids are worse at math and reading than they were 10 years ago. And somehow even worse than it was 35 years ago? So low-key when an older generation says,
kids are dumber now.
They're kinda right. So why does it feel like American education's on the decline? Well, I mean, I don't know. Maybe we can go back to 1994. 1994! American education has changed a lot since the 90s. And I ain't talking about how they used to teach us how to write cursive, made it seem like some important life skill, and then by 2010 they were like, nah. We don't need that no more. I'm talking about the rising popularity of state standardized testing. Around this time, the failing public education system was at top of mind for a lot of people in America. If we take it 10 years back to the 80s, there was an overwhelming concern about the quality of our children's education because assessments revealed that United States students were performing worse and sometimes even ranked among the lowest in math and science scores compared to other developed countries at the time like Japan. And you want to hear something even crazier? All this worry came to its peak in 1983 when a national report called A Nation at Risk by the U.S. Secretary of Education revealed that after 19 academic tests, American students were never ranked first. They weren't ranked second. As a matter of fact, we were ranked last. 7 times compared to other industrialized nations. The authors of the report call this an open letter to the American people that public schools are, quote, an urgent need for improvement. Blah, blah, blah. It's essentially a 36-page document that says, if we don't get our act together, we are cooked. So in 1994, they dropped the Improving America's School Act, which, amongst other things, increased federal spending on schools and pushed a nationwide policy to develop academic content standards, aka the bare minimum of what students should be learning, and increased standardized testing state to state, intended as a way for students to have a baseline standard quality of education. Heck, they even promised to invest a minimum of $750 million additionally every fiscal year through 1999. And you're probably thinking, wow, increasing government spending? Active initiatives to improve public schools? Wow, we sure are lucky to live in a government that actually cares for us. And I thought the same too at one point. Until I took my meds. But yeah, this failed almost immediately. It's actually almost embarrassing how bad they dropped the ball. You see, the law required each individual state to create standards for what they taught, a benchmark on how well the students should know what they taught, and assessments to measure progress. And in order for schools to qualify for the additional government funding, they had to hit said benchmarks and show progress over time. But the problem is though, the federal government gave no specific guidelines for how rigorous those standards have to be, so they were literally left to figure out everything on their own. That's like your mom saying, hey, clean your room. It looks like a mess. Okay, how clean should the room be? I don't know, you figure it out. What does a clean room look like to you? I mean, I just picked up this singular sock off the ground, so the room is technically cleaner than how it used to be. Cool. Here's $750 million. Each state had to create their own definition of what being proficient in reading and math meant. They had to determine how hard the tests should be, and they had to define how they measure whether or not someone was ready for college. So, coming as a complete shock to nobody, this led to very inconsistent, very unequal measurements of proficiency and readiness state to state. What quote-unquote meets the standard in New York could be considered bottom tier in Missouri, for example. The quality of a child's education was so varied, it was like putting your child's future into a slot machine, and parents had to pray if their child's school was decent enough for them to grow in. It sucks even more so when you realize the federal government never punished or even penalized states for having weak standards or making no progress. They wouldn't have qualified for the additional funding, but they could also make no real changes or improvements and still be fine legal-wise. So yeah, that's pretty stupid. Even worse when you realize a lot of schooling districts got the wrong message out of this. Essentially, the government said, hey, you help schools improve and you'll qualify for extra funding, but like, you have to decide what that looks like though. And they heard, so if I do the bare minimum, I get more money? So surprisingly, a lot of schools in America turned into a check-the-box system, where they did just enough to qualify and make it look like they're doing good, but no real focus were on the students and actually improving education. Not like they would have been able to improve much regardless, because even if hypothetically this act worked as planned, it still did nothing to tackle the other several issues that plague the American schools that all tie into the base infrastructure and systemic inequalities that are rooted in American education. But who knows? Maybe the next decade does a better job. Y'all remember how it was like to go to school in the 2000s? I remember when they used to roll out that TV stand and everyone in class knew it was about to be a good day. Our friend Martin was on repeat. If you know, you know. 7-Up, not the soda, but the game in class where apparently if you won, you were a cheater. Oh, that little parachute game that we did in gym class was pretty fire. I guess that was more of a 90s thing, but I remember doing that a lot in the early 2000s too. But you want to know what I don't remember? Apparently how convoluted the education system was. Piggybacking off of the failed initiatives of the 90s, American citizens realized there was still a lot left to be desired in terms of improving children's education. The problem American schools still faced were that too many students were still failing their classes, and they noticed there was way too large of a gap between the lower test scores of minority children, students from lower income families, and children with special needs versus the higher test scores of their usually white middle-class peers. So as an attempt to combat this, in 2002, the Bush administration signed the No Child Left Behind Act into law. Remember that problem in the 90s where schools weren't really punished for sucking, and the federal government set no standards of accountability, so lots of states set the bar so low to check the box and make themselves look good? Yeah, well, thankfully this bill was their attempt at changing that, amongst other things of course. The No Child Left Behind Act increased the federal role in holding all schools responsible for the academic progress of all students. It mandated standardized testing for students in reading and math from grade 3 to grade 8. And not only do you have to report the results of the student population overall, but now you have to report the specific subset groups to see how each individual demographic fared academically. You see, this was important because, as the name implies, the goal was to not leave any child of any demographic behind. In the past, when reporting academic results, some schools would hide behind a pretty high overall score, but when you peel the layers slightly back, you see that the score is being held up and dominated by one subgroup, which is great for them, I guess, but this shows an obvious neglect for underserved students with less access to similar resources. The idea was to focus on equity rather than just equality, to make sure everyone, regardless of socioeconomic background, were given the tailored resources they needed to grow. It's actually really cool too, because now they've put an emphasis on hiring teachers that are quote-unquote highly qualified, which generally speaking just means they at least have a bachelor's degree in the subject they're teaching in and a state certification. Oh yeah, and schools actually get punished now if they don't hit the state benchmarks. Took him long enough. Essentially, the law created something called the adequate yearly progress, which is the annual benchmark each school must hit to prove that they're making actual progress in children's education. And long story short, if a school doesn't meet their AYP standard every year, they get punished, especially if they miss multiple years in a row. If they miss 2 years, students are allowed to transfer to better schools in the same district. They miss 3, the school is required to offer free tutoring. God forbid they miss 5. At that point, the state has to intervene and more than likely overhaul the entire working staff, aka people are going to get fired. So if you remember your teacher stressing out more than usual every time your school is giving a standardized test, that's probably why. All right, calm. They tried to fix the no standards thing. They even tried to tackle the socioeconomic disparity between students. Surely this bill laid the groundwork to fix America's education problem. So, funny thing, here's the problem with putting so much of an emphasis on schools needing their students to hit certain test scores every year. That's all the teachers focus on. The biggest criticism of the No Child Left Behind Act is that it created a habit and a culture of teachers teaching to the test, as opposed to teaching so students actually learn and understand what's going on. Teachers in schools were so petrified with the idea of not hitting their yearly requirement that they begun to teach in a way that focused more on only learning things that will be on the test at the end of the year, and not on teaching for general comprehension. This especially sucks because this forces kids to prioritize short-term memorization rather than taking things in that they could apply to their overall lives or a future career. If students don't believe what they're learning through the school year is applicable to their lives after test season is over, there's no incentive to remember anything substantial. This also narrowed down the overall curriculum to overemphasize on math and reading, which are both important, obviously, but like, there are other subjects, guys. Come on. God forbid you have a child that's interested in something creative. Screw them, I guess. And I'll be honest, if you were a teacher during this time and you spent the entire school year prepping your students for a test at the end of the year and not really teaching outside of that, I don't blame you. Think about it. If your job security is being threatened because your class can't seem to get their act together and pass a test, you damn right I'm gonna spend the whole year making sure that they pass. Are you kidding me? Teachers were demoralized because as the face of the classroom, they were often blamed for the shortcomings with the school system that weren't their fault, by the way, nor did they have the power to change it. They were given 100% of the blame for low test scores, although for the most part, they weren't in charge of the overall school curriculum. On top of the fact, they were incentivized for bad behavior under the stress of school penalization. Literally in 2008, Atlanta public schools were under suspicion on cheating and rigging test scores to pass AYP standards, with over 180 teachers being involved since 2001. Well, hey, that sucks, but I wonder in the next decade if teachers will be treated better. They weren't. 30% drop off of teacher enrollment from 2010 to 2019, but we'll get into that. I remember school in the 2010s the most because that decade was my middle school, high school, and college years. They were fun for what it was, I suppose, but even back then I remember there being way too big of a focus on passing the end of the year test than I think there probably should have been, but that wasn't 100% the teacher's fault in retrospect. I don't know if you sense a pattern here, but it does feel like teachers are being scapegoated for a lot of the overall problems the American education system faced. Granted, we all know and have met a teacher that genuinely sucked, and the hate towards them was justified. But across the board so far, it seems like teachers are being attacked from all angles, and unfortunately, the 2010s ain't an exception. First of all, during the early 2010s, the Obama administration dropped Race to the Top, which was an education reform initiative designed as a competition of sorts. Essentially, the goal was to spur states on and force them to innovate and find ways to improve education faster through competitive means. And the top scoring states won additional federal funding, and the loser states got nothing. It's funny because in hindsight, you would think that the states that made less improvements would be the ones in more need of extra funding, not the ones that performed well in spite of it. But do you, I guess, Mr. President? I'm sure it worked out just fine. First of all, y'all remember when Common Core was first coming out? That was created as an attempt to finally fix the issue of the varied educational standards state to state, at least in regards to reading and math. It was a more rigorous academic standard that a lot of states weren't used to, and one of the guidelines to Race to the Top was to implement the brand new Common Core standards across the board. The problem was, imagine as a teacher already getting pressure from school administration to improve your class's scores quickly so they can win more funding, while at the same time being asked to adopt, relearn, and reteach a completely brand new learning standard within that same time frame, with no help, mind you. Oh, and by the way, if the students don't do good on the test, your job is on the line. Nice. Can you imagine the stress and the unnecessary pressures teachers must have had at the time? No wonder children's education is so all over the place. Even if the teachers wanted to try a different approach, they can't because their hands are tied. And you're probably like, okay, it looks like teachers are overworked and underappreciated, but they still make a salary. Surely the pay is equivalent to their stress and makes all the pressure worth it. My brother, you might want to take a seat for this one. You know, it hurt my soul when I found out that a teacher's salary in some states were barely above the poverty line. When adjusted for inflation, from 2009 to 2019, teachers' salary in most states actually didn't change at all. Imagine working your butt off in a thankless profession just to make a salary with less buying power than you did 10 years ago. This is just one of the many factors that contributes to the 30% drop off in teacher enrollment, like I stated before. More teachers leaving the profession and less new teachers getting started. If that's not an obvious insight to the decline of American education, then I do not know what is. And if you think that's bad, that ain't the only major drop that occurred in the 2010s.
Cell phones in schools. They are devices we love to hate, right?
According to researchers, smartphones are taking a toll on your attention span. A study found a lot of people can only hold their attention for 8 seconds.
80% say cell phones at school have negative effects on academics and social development.
Crazy to think about the big difference 10 years can make between the mid-2000s and the mid-2010s. Yeah, in the 2000s, schools had desktop computers and potentially laptops, but the most distracted I ever saw anyone using technology in class was when we played Arthur's Computer Adventure when the teacher wasn't looking. But now it seems like it's normal for every teenager to have a cell phone. I mean, as a matter of fact, by 2015, 73% of teens had smartphones, and by 2019, it was over 90%. Back then, when you were bored in class, you kind of had to suck it up and deal with it, or, you know, draw on your desk or something like that. But as a student in the 2010s, If you're bored, whip out Instagram, whip out Snapchat for 30 minutes until class was over. And there's so many studies about the effects social media and having a smartphone in general does to our attention spans, so there's no real need to go super in depth about it. The fact that brain rot is an actual word in the Webster dictionary proves that our society is already too far gone. But focus specifically in a classroom setting has gone down drastically, making it more difficult for students to not get distracted, impairing long-term memory of important topics, ruining overall reading comprehension because your brain is constantly switching focus from one thing to the other, and overall losing patience for slower-paced tasks and schoolwork, thus leading to worse grades and test scores. Yeah, technology was a huge problem for students of this decade, but I have a good feeling that there's no way it can get any worse in the following decade. I don't think I need to remind you guys how going to school was like during the early 2020s because
Coronavirus outbreak.
New York City tonight, the original epicenter,
continues to either cancel classes or move to remote learning.
suddenly making the call to close public schools, turning to remote learning for now.
I think y'all remember. The COVID-19 pandemic caused a massive disruption in everyday life, and arguably the school system was disrupted worst of all, with school closures affecting over 50 million students nationwide in spring 2020. These closures lasted anywhere from a few weeks in some states to over a year in others. So of course this meant that remote learning had to be prioritized, which you would think would be a pretty simple temporary fix, but unfortunately that had its own set of problems. For starters, no one could have predicted this pandemic happening, as far as we know. So in the beginning, there were a lot of households that were unequipped to be suitable for online learning. 21%, in fact, of school-age kids lacked reliable internet. I believe a lot of school districts provided laptops or tablets for their students, but they didn't get it for a while. So there were tons of younger kids who had to use their parents' cell phone in order to attend class, or simply didn't attend class at all. There are also just blatant differences in availability to resources depending on your family's income level. For example, parents of higher income families had the ability to hire tutors for their kids and work from home to provide more support for their child, while parents of lower income families may have been essential workers, having no choice but to leave their kids unsupervised throughout the day without that parental support. Now, if you were to think about it, you might believe that college students, high schoolers, maybe even middle schoolers were hit the hardest during this time, but nah, it had to have been kindergartners and other early year students that got it the worst. Younger children literally need peer socialization as a part of their early stage brain development. Without a classroom setting, not only are they deprived of that, but they lack the awareness of classroom routines and discipline, stunting their growth and emotional maturity. Teachers of younger students of 2021 to 2022 reported more behavioral problems and less of an ability to handle frustration. To be honest, just in general, the quality of learning was lesser in a remote learning world. Some teachers only doing a few hours of live teaching a day, and it's easier for a student to hide behind a Zoom screen if they're zoning out or confused about a topic that a teacher in person would have normally spotted. We also got to factor in home distractions because we spoke about phones before, but imagine trying to focus on your class assignment when your PS5 is right there. Also, TV, your noisy siblings, getting distracted by chores you gotta do around the house. It wasn't necessarily the best environment for people to focus in, even if they did take their education serious. And I know we're talking about students here, but let's not act like teachers are any better either. Most teachers had little to no prior experience teaching in a remote online setting. I remember one time in college, half the class was dedicated to my 75-year-old professor trying to figure out how to get his screen share to work. Like, what are we really doing here, guys? Any interaction between professors and students were limited. Kindergartners and early graders learning phonics requires watching the teacher's mouth movements and getting feedback on pronunciation when reading words, both of which were very difficult to do well enough over video. Math was especially more difficult to learn over Zoom for kids. Math is one of those subjects where you have to learn the material in sequential order, so if you miss a topic or aren't good enough at a topic before moving on, it'll make future math topics harder. So the problem with learning it primarily virtual were that some topics weren't given the needed time or hands-on experience for it to be taught effectively, which of course made it more difficult for students to learn any future math lessons, period. All of these factors during the COVID-19 pandemic contributed to the massive learning regression of the average American child today. Kids today have a worse reading and math ability than they did in the 90s, so much so that some first grade teachers in the 2022 to 2023 period reported that students entered the new school year without basic alphabet knowledge, and middle school students had their math skills regressed 1 to 2 levels below their grade. Yeah, guys, that sucks. And Sorry, I can't think of a good transition. We're gonna talk about AI. Isn't it crazy to think about there was a time where the average person didn't know what AI was? Imagine being one of the first people in 2022 to use ChatGPT for a college essay. I bet those professors must have been so confused. But this shows an obvious gap between the resources students have access to today versus what they had to deal with not even 20 years ago. Back in the 2000s, for example, if you were stuck on an assignment due the next day and you were nowhere near being finished, you were cooked. Now in the 2020s, it can be 10 minutes before the assignment is due at midnight, but that's okay because ChatGPT just spat out a 20-page essay in 30 seconds to save the day. I mean, it goes without saying how bad this has been and how much worse of an impact this will have on education as a whole. Over-reliance on AI in education shifts the entire focus from attempting, failing, and learning the material on your own to simply finishing an assignment and not really learning anything of value yourself. It's crazy too because not too long ago, teachers were complaining when students were Googling test answers on Quizlet, but now with AI, laziness when it comes to learning has gone to a whole new level. Whenever students have the ability to offload their need to think and problem solve onto something else, they begin to erode the critical thinking skills they need to grow in cognitive ability. And without that, we'll simply grow to become a nation relying on everything else to do the thinking for us. And of course, schools have since become aware of this, so they've implemented systems to detect whether or not assignments were created with AI or not. These detection strategies themselves can be kind of hit or miss, but hey, at least it's something. But also, I think a key component a lot of people tend to miss when criticizing the use of AI in schools is that sometimes AI can legit just be wrong. How many times have you researched something and Google AI gives you the most ridiculous, obviously wrong answer possible? The problem then becomes if students are incapable of thinking for themselves and blindly trusting AI's confidence, they'll just regurgitate wrong answers believing they're true. It's like what they say in boxing, for example. It's easier to teach someone how to box that's never learned how to than someone who's learned to box the wrong way. The same applies here. It's often easier to teach someone who's never learned the topic than it is to help someone unlearn the wrong things. AI isn't all bad though, despite popular belief. There are some genuine benefits to using it in American education system. For example, AI has been a huge help for ESLs, English Second Language students, who require live translations and real-time captioning, as well as students with disabilities who need a personalized text-to-speech curriculum. And I'm sure AI has helped teachers grade a couple tests here and there, especially if it's only multiple choice. Who cares if it's a human who does it or an automated machine? But let's just hope we don't eventually get too carried away with having AI do all our thinking for us. Okay? Can we promise that? Is that a fair request? And on that note, based on what I researched, that's why it feels like the American education system feels like it gets worse every 10 years or so. Goodbye.